a very long time in this country, we've been trying to figure out why we saw crime increase so rapidly between about the 1960s to the early 1990s. And Kevin Drum from Mother Jones wrote this unbelievable article about how lead could have possibly played a role in violence and crime in this country. Now, it sounds ridiculous. You know, lead, really? How is that going to make people more violent, and how is that going to increase crime? Well, there was a researcher back in 1994 by the name of Rick Nevin. He studied as a consultant for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and what he found was that lead was having a negative impact on brain developments, whether it came to IQ, whether it came to the prefrontal cortex, which actually manages your behavior, your impulses, things like that. And he started realizing that there was a correlation between lead in the environment and violent crime. In fact, let's take a quick look at this, U-shaped graph, and it shows you how with the increase of lead in the environment, you saw an increase of crime. So again, this is just establishing a correlation, not causation, but we'll get to causation in just a second.
So, with that huge dip in violent crime in the 1990s, there were so many different theories, and I remember covering it. And the leading theory was, for example, in New York, where crime went down dramatically, was the broken windows theory, that if you have one broken window, it'll lead to many broken windows. So if you fix small little things like people jumping the turnstiles in the subway or getting rid of the squeegee men, as Giuliani did when he was mayor of New York and Bill Bratton did when he was a police commissioner there, it'll actually lead to a cascading positive effect. And everybody liked that theory. I like that theory because it was logical. It made sense that that would work. Here's the part that nobody ever explained, and I always thought, but wait a minute, there's a big problem here. Because it wasn't just New York that crime went down, and nobody could ever explain it to me. In fact, in Washington, LA, Dallas, it went down 70, 75%. And Bill Bratton wasn't in all those places. He eventually wound up going to LA, but they didn't do all those same programs in the 90s. In fact, in New York, crime started going down in 1990, which was 3 years before Giuliani and Bratton got there. So there was something always fishy about that. And whenever you go to any explanation, as Kevin Drum explained, and there are dozens of explanations of why crime went up and then why crime went down, it would never match the data perfectly. And going into this article, I was skeptical. I was like, lead?
I know, I had the same feelings about it. I'm like, no, not buying it, not buying it. There has to be other factors that play a role. And by the way, I want you guys to understand, Kevin Drum and these researchers in the article are not making, the assumption, or they're not trying to prove that lead is the only reason why crime happens. Of course, there are different factors that play a role, but to deny that lead does not play a role at all would be naive. And there's overwhelming evidence that proves that. So as I mentioned, Rick Nevin was able to prove or to show correlation. However, in the 1990s, another researcher from Harvard University came along, Jessica Reyes, that wanted to show causation. And the way that she did that was she pointed to EPA regulations. So the EPA gets involved and they realize that lead is harmful to our brain development. And it has a negative impact on the white matter, on the gray matter. So we should do whatever is possible to get rid of it from the environment. So we started banning lead in our gasoline in 1996, which was fairly recently. And we also started taking action against lead in housing. Okay, so homes built before 1960 had lead-based paint, and there was also a lead coat on windows. So as a result, that was having an impact. It was exposing us to too much lead. As soon as the EPA got involved, we started seeing more regulations, but it was not uniform throughout the entire country. Okay.
So I want to say two quick things about that. Number one, I immediately assumed it was the lead in the paint, but it turns out that's not what causes the most amount of damage. It was the leaded gasoline.
Yes.
That was the primary driver of all this. So it actually literally went up into the air, and everybody was curious why, or I guess they partly assumed it's a big city, there's more people, there's naturally going to be more crime. It turns out since we have removed the lead from gasoline, that's not true. Small towns and big cities have the same crime rate. And one possible reason that lead would have had a bigger effect in the big cities is because there's more cars in a smaller area. And so the lead from the gasoline built up more and affected people more.
Right.
And so, and the second point is, to her point, it's not that, like, for example, violent crime starts to go down in 1990, we start to take some of the actions in 96. Her point is, here, let me show you the different places where we took different action on lead and what it led to. So, and this is, when you look at all these different studies, what really swung me isn't just New York, isn't just one of the studies. It's that Kevin mentioned 2 or 3 studies, part of what Anna's mentioning here. And they did it by city, they did it by state, lead levels, crime, up, down, okay? They did it by country.
Yeah.
No matter where they did it, you see lead levels go up, crime goes up. Lead levels go down, crime goes down. Now you can argue correlation all day long, but once you look at the data, and by the way, when you show the data on how lead affects the human mind, well, then it becomes a bit of an overwhelming case.
And by the way, as I mentioned, when these anti-lead regulations were implemented, they weren't implemented uniformly. So even within the United States, you would see these variations, right? Where you would see crimes decrease as soon as you take the lead regulations, in that area when you implement them. So that's when the Harvard University researcher gets involved, and she shows, she provides further proof to show that it's more than just a correlation.
Right, and you can see how it might cause it if it really leads to these effects in the mind, which it apparently does.
And let me be clear as to why it would make people more violent. It's because of what it does to the prefrontal cortex, right? The gray matter of the brain. Now, this is the part that regulates your behavior. So if you are exposed to too much lead at an early age and you have that much damage to your prefrontal cortex, then you can't control impulses. You're more likely to be violent. And this is stuff that's proven by MRI scans, sorry.
Yeah, and so when you look at, in one of the studies, they break down New Orleans. Within the city, district by district, and wherever they see the highest lead contamination is where they see the highest amount of crime. Now look, it's a city that, it's, the same areas are poor, etc., but where there's more lead, there's more crime. And so the evidence mounts and mounts and mounts. And by the way, so you say, wait a minute, now we've been at unleaded gasoline, so we should be beyond this. And you see, of course, crime dipping, but the lead is not gone. Unfortunately, it has settled in the soil.
Yeah, it's settled in the soil. We have to take further efforts to get rid of that lead in the soil. And also keep in mind that in the summertime, when the weather gets extremely dry, what happens is that soil gets kicked up into the air, and all of a sudden we have that atmospheric lead playing a role in our environment. So, and of course, that has an impact on our brains. Research was first established in the mid-1990s. So why is it coming up now? Why is Kevin Drum bringing it up now? And how come criminologists never focused on it? It's because, for instance, law enforcement, they want to make sure that the work that they're doing is important, right? Private prison companies, they want to make sure that incarcerating more people has led to the decrease in crime.
He made another great point about that. That's why we're just over the top on this brilliant article. Look, cops want to say it's all because of the cops.
And what about the drug warriors too?
Right, and then you got the drug warriors saying it's all because of the drugs, give us more money to do more war on drugs. You got Brattons and the Giulianis, the politicians who want to take credit. Nobody wins politically if it turns out it's lead, right? And so everybody's like, I don't know about that lead theory. The overwhelming evidence, put that aside, right? And so, look, the cleanup, in order to get it out of the soil, et cetera, would take about $20 billion. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but Kevin Drum makes a compelling case that you would save many multiples of that. And by the way, it's our frickin' kids, man.
Yeah.
I don't want my kids' prefrontal cortex being melted away by lead.
Can we also just give a quick big ups to the EPA? Because the EPA is the reason why we saw change and regulations when it came to lead in our gasolines. If it weren't for the EPA, we would continue to see lead in gasoline.
Let me go further on that point, because that's a terrific point. Now, all these guys, regulation costs us so much, etc. If the EPA had not pushed to go towards unleaded gasoline, get the lead out, literally, out of our society, that chart wouldn't have been a U. That chart would have just either kept going up or at least stabilized at tremendous levels of violent crime, which, let alone the devastating effect it would have had on our society, would have cost us billions, if not trillions of dollars in lost income, yada, yada, lost lives, and the list goes on and on. So the EPA has saved us an unbelievable amount of money and suffering by going in that direction. And by the way, people always say, progressives, they're weak, they can't get anything done. No, no, no. That's why I always tell you, money in politics started at a mass level in 1978 when the Supreme Court said corporations have the right to spend unlimited money in politics. Now, they didn't have the unlimited right to give political donations until Citizens United, but they could make political they could do lobbying, they could do some donations, etc. That right was, quote unquote, right, was established in 1978. Before then, Ralph Nader got Nixon to pass the EPA. You know, so Ralph Nader has done some questionable things later, you know, obviously famously in 2000 costing Gore the election, and people have strong opinions about that either way, right? But you got to give Nader credit, man. The Raider Naders at the time, they got OSHA, that's what they were called. They got OSHA, they got seatbelts, they got the EPA, and they saved untold millions of lives. So, man, whenever they tell you environmental regulation is not necessary, don't believe the hype. Look at what a difference this made.